the average span for mental focus, it is rather small. I mean, commonly nowadays we consider it to be around 12 seconds. So that's how much we normally would be able to stay focused. Allow me to just briefly return a bit back to the idea of science. So I could later on go further and give you some arguments. In science, there is, of course, many times a bit of a discussion regarding experimentation and formulating theories. Generally, we kept a kind of very idealistic view in that direction, because many of the natural philosophers, nowadays we call them scientists, believed that scientific knowledge is little more than properly applying observation and experimental techniques on natural phenomena. That is also why in the philosophy of science we find the concept of experimentum crucis, which is that sort of ideal experiment which, by applying it, can alone determine which, for example, of the two rival hypotheses is correct. So will teach us how to immediately discard whatever it is false. That is also why, in an idealistic manner, we somehow think that scientific theories are simply direct results of the experimental results and observations, without in fact having any kind of other interference in the process. But when we look in a more direct way to the reality of science, to the reality of the scientific experiments and scientific facts, what we observe is that, in general, the experimental results that we collect, what we observe, so to say, it is most of the times a part of a theoretical framework. That is why I just mentioned before, the perspective of scientific method or of a disciplined manner to study means that we also learn how to observe. We learn how to measure. So that learning process, it is already a part of a theoretical framework. Thus, in fact, in reality, we do not find some sort of theory-neutral language for capturing observations. We know we don't really drive experiments without knowing, so to say, in a way or another beforehand what we want to prove. So in this direction, the entire process, it is basically part of that, because what we want to search, the manner in which we search, the data we choose once we've been carried out some experiments, all these are practically guided from the very beginning by that kind of theoretical framework we already had. And once more, allow me to remind you what we just said before. That theoretical framework is often a consensual perspective and not necessarily something which stands, so to say, by itself alone. Of course, because of this, what we also have learned is that when we want to carry out an experiment, there are a few steps which we necessarily have to respect. And they go like this. I just briefly mentioned them because I would like afterwards to look into them from a different angle. So when carrying out an experiment, we need first of all to do some checks and some calibrations from the very beginning. So say if, just to give you an example here at hand, if we want to measure a certain kind of distance, then we need to have a proper modality to measure the distance. So if we are measuring something in the range of meters, we should have a ruler. Of course, if we are measuring something in the range of kilometers, which have a telemeter, so we need to have a proper check and calibration. Then, before we carry a new experiment, the first thing we ought to do is to try to reproduce certain artifacts which are already known in advance. So by that, in a way, proving that the manner in which we measure it is correct. Of course, if we look upon artifacts, things that we already know in advance, then we also have the chance to eliminate any kind of possible sources of error. Now, once that has been done, to the best of our knowledge, we carry out the experiment and we obtain some data. Now, we are supposed to use that data and to argue the validity of the data. Of course, the validity of the data should be argued, so to say, only in connection to that phenomenon that we are wanting to look at. So because of this, normally we need to use a certain independent, possibly, and well-built theory regarding the phenomena we want to observe. And of course, we should use that kind of theory in such a way to aim to validate what we have measured. Basically, as we would put it in scientific terms, we would normally build an apparatus based on that theory, which is simply helping us to validate what we have measured. And of course, the last but not the least of these rules, it is that, of course, we should use statistical arguments. That is also why, as you know, often in science we need to repeat many times certain kind of measurements just to be sure that also from the statistical perspective we didn't have any accidents, any errors, and we obtained something which is in a way fundamented from that point of view. Now let's, from this point of view, also simply look upon how the yogic system will teach us to implement a certain type of spiritual practice. I picked up for you here an example, mental concentration, simply because I already mentioned the beginning of Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, and there already had the perspective of calming down the mental fluctuations, which is of course part of the training towards mental concentration. So here is how normally the yogic system invites us to apply such a spiritual practice. First of all, we are presented with a very simple fact, and that is that the average span for mental focus, it is rather small. I mean, commonly nowadays we consider it to be around 12 seconds. So that's how much we normally would be able to stay focused. Of course, with the whole development of our century, with all the devices we use and so on, unfortunately we can expect even shorter spans of mental focus than 12 seconds. Now, the first step into this form of practice will be to run a simple experimental check. So, aiming to verify which is the current span of mental focus we have right now when we want to begin the practice. Then, once we have checked that, of course, we are invited to start a certain type of daily training process, and the goal of the process will be, of course, to extend the span of mental focus. Also, regarding this kind of training, we are normally advised to eliminate all possible sources of disturbance and error, like, for example, trying to have as little as possible noise, not to be tired, and because of this, even less attentive when we do our practice, and so forth. So they are in fact given very clear directions where we can look for sources of disturbance, and we are of course invited to remove them, because else such sources could render basically useless our training. Of course, if available, we are also invited to use modalities to check that result, either by using very simple things, like, for example, using a device which can measure the time span, so the span of the mental focus, or of course, nowadays in modern times, we can even involve in such a process a more modern device, like a muse, like an inner balance device, and so forth. We have nowadays, we find on the market, in fact, plenty of such devices which can basically objectify this part of our training. And then, of course, we are invited to maintain such a clearly defined frame for our practice, or if you allow me to call it, for the experiment that we are carrying out, both in terms of timing and modality. So if we picked up a certain type of exercise, then of course we are invited to apply the same exercise every day for a certain amount of time, so that the data we collect can be, of course, correctly compared with each other, and also, if we see changes there, to have a clear significance. If we would simply all the time change the methodology, it is like we would try to run an experiment, but every new measurement is done with a different device. Well, that surely would create a lot of confusion. So from that point of view, of course, again, we can as well use devices, or we can also simply resort to do that in a more natural manner by just, again, the use of a clock or a timer and things like this. Of course, now this is obviously a systematic approach, and in the yogic tradition, such a systematic approach of a spiritual practice even has a well-defined name. It's called tapas, which can be translated in many ways, but surely one translation, it is spiritual discipline. And in this system that I mentioned to you before, the Ashtanga system, which Patanjali indicates as a modality to carry out a spiritual practice, tapas is quite important. In fact, it sits in, we can say, the position number 2. The position number 1 is yama, position number 2 is niyama, so tapas is already there in position number 2, something which is from this point of view quite important. Thus, to also here come a little bit to conclude everything that we aimed to discuss here today. Again, the yogic tradition, the yogic system, which is, once more, a system of observances about the vision of man and the cosmos, but which also takes in consideration the correspondences between the inner world and the outer world. It is for sure a system containing of different forms of spiritual practice which aim to validate certain universal principles through what usually yoga calls direct experience. But now I also invite you here to understand that validating principles through direct experience, it is what nonetheless nowadays in the science world we are calling experiencing or experimenting, carrying out experiments. That is also why yoga, it is in fact a system which seems to be defined by a very clear and thoroughly formulated methodology. Is based on a systematic approach of both the inner and the outer experiences, and not on just kind of consensual and often blind beliefs. That is also why the correct modality, we can say, to apply the yoga practice, it is from this point of view almost identical, like step by step, with all the conditions that a scientist has to fulfill in order to carry out an experiment which afterwards it is accepted, so to say, both as methodology but also in terms of results of data as a scientific fact. That is also why, probably again, for me, many years ago, when I came in contact with the yogic system, and I've been as well studying physics, I realized that this was an inevitable choice, because I wanted to have, in everything I did from the spiritual point of view, that kind of thoroughness, clarity, which normally we should find, of course, in the scientific world. Thus, from this point of view, to end my presentation, I invite you to, of course, study the yogic system, to, of course, absorb this very important perspective, methodology what the yogic system have, and by this, of course, to be able to validate all that you discover, all the transformations that you might encounter, and so forth. Thank you very much for your attention.